Somebody asked me at the end of the last session about popes who
quit?
Yeah, who quit. Popes ceasing to be popes was called abdication until modern times. Now it's called resignation.
Oh.
And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cases undisputed of popes resigning or abdicating. The most recent one was, of course, Benedict XVI. We all know about that, the president.
What's the one before that?
But the earliest one was Pontian.
Somebody close that door.
And Pontian popped off in 235 for very good reasons. He had been in the persecution of Decius, and Decius exiled him to hard labor in a distant land, and he had already been elected Bishop of Rome, and he didn't want to leave the seat just vacant while he wasn't there. So he said the only way he could make room for a new election and a new pope was to abdicate, and so he did so for the good of everyone, for the good of the church.
Okay.
The next one, I think I have it in order here, is Silverius. Silverius was a crook.
Don't sugarcoat it.
I'm going to write Silverius the Crook.
He was a known crook.
And he left in 537 because the Empress Theodora couldn't stand him any longer. She put great pressure on him and told him that with all his finagling, if he didn't just go away, she would make life extremely unpleasant for him. And the Empress was in a position to do that. So he said, it's been nice.
Now, where was he sitting, in Rome or in Constantinople?
Oh, he was, the Pope?
Yeah.
Oh, the Pope was in Rome, but
Okay.
the Empress, of course, was in Constantinople.
Okay, because I was confused.
Then, the next one, Gregory the 12th, may have been a crook, but he was asked by the Council of Constance to please go away because the evidence was overwhelming that he was an adulterer, a perjurer, a schismatic, and a heretic.
Doesn't sound so bad.
Oh, what was that
I
all?
guess a heretic.
Yeah, that's the one that sent you.
So he didn't say, my lawyer will call your lawyer. Okay, bye-bye. So yeah, he went in.
So I would take it that Silverius and Gregory would be your awful popes.
Oh,
Oh, there's
Or they're
they get a lot awfully.
It's really a spectrum, right?
Yeah,
This is the third week, by the way, excuse me.
yeah.
This is the third week, not the fourth week, so we did fill it out last week.
You did fill it, okay,
Yeah.
then
Oh, okay, all right.
then I was once
That's all
again
right.
confused.
Mine's got done for next week. Join the club.
And then the best known one, he should come in here.
Oh, okay.
Celestine V is the one people tend to know about. And Celestine V was a medieval pope at a time of great corruption in the papacy and great outrage among the people and the lower clergy about corruption in the papacy. So they said, you know, the big shot said, we got to give them a pope they respect, but not a pope who will interfere with us very much. So this is the Curia trying to do its thing, get a figurehead, nice pope, but go on doing what they were doing all the time. So they found that a Franciscan hermit named Pietro Morone was very much loved by people everywhere. He made pilgrimages to him. He just had a little cave somewhere, and he heard confessions and gave advice. And they said, well, he's not that far away. Why don't we make him pope? he won't know anything about how to be pope. We'll do the actual poping. And he'll smile and hear confessions and give blessings, and everyone will be happy. So to sell to Pietro, it was then complete surprise. This delegation arrived from Rome to tell him that they would like him to come to Rome because they could guarantee he would be elected Pope. That was all set up.
Fixes it.
So, you know, being an obedient Christian, he said, okay, if Bishop of Rome thinks I should be the next Bishop of Rome, I'll do it. So they brought him down. His predecessor had just died, a natural death. And Celestine was elected resoundingly. There were great cheers, and great cheers among the people. It was made a kind of big PR thing. You know, we found you a holy pope. And so he assumed his seat in the Rome, and they began doing all the things they were doing before, which were pretty awful. Once in a while, he would kind of ask, what's going on around here? And they kept kind of putting him off and putting him off. And then he was moved, moved to Naples to kind of get him out of the way so they could work there without him tapping on the shoulder and saying, what's that all about? So they, you know, he was still Pope, but he was well out of the way physically and all. But the people still liked him and wanted to know why he was down there in Naples. And so the representatives of the Curia came to him and said, we feel very bad about this because you know, you were not raised in this context. You're not a curial guy, and you don't know how things are done around here. So you know, maybe it's the wrong job for you. What do you think? And he said, "Oh, thank God, get out of the crazy place." He found it, I mean, quite clear. He found it scandalous, confusing, you know, awful in every way. And he also felt totally incompetent because he didn't know what any of the procedures were, you know, where the bodies were buried and so on, literally and figuratively.
Now, how old of a guy was he?
How old he was? He was 50-something, man.
What year was it? What year was?
Well, I'm sorry.
What year?
Celestine V. What year?
Celestine V,
So
yeah.
when did he quit?
He quit in 1294.
1294. Okay, so he
So
was
he fits
before
in there,
Gregory.
yes.
Okay.
So he did quit, and the one who had most urged him to quit became the next pope, and probably the shrewdest and most tyrannical pope almost ever. But then another problem arose because people didn't like the new pope very much. He claimed to rule everything. He claimed all temporal sovereignty and all religious sovereignty. He ruled the world. And that made some of the world kind of unhappy.
Now, what was his name?
Boniface VIII, we'll give him some time. He deserves time, yeah. And people said, we miss old Celestine. He was nice. So Boniface said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll bring Celestine back to Rome. And I'll give him a very nice place in the papal prison in Castel San Angelo.
Papal prison?
Yes. So Celestine, again, not knowing what's going on, he's invited back to Rome. Is it my birthday or something? So he brings him back, he puts him in Castel San Angelo, tells the people that Celestine isn't as well as he might be. But they've arranged very pleasant accommodations for him there in the prison. If you've been to Rome, it's a huge, still there, exactly as it was, huge looming structure at the end of the bridge. Big circular fortress-like thing in tiers. So he went in there and he never came out. Now, whether he passed quietly away while having a really good time, or was murdered. There are many theories about that, many reports at the time. There was very widespread rumors that he was murdered, but nobody could prove anything. And by then they had Boniface VIII to deal with, who was trying to rule heaven and earth. So those are the five who did actually resign or abdicate. And you can see good reasons and bad reasons, good guys and bad guys. But none since the 15th century, until the present century.
Okay. It seems that over all this course and all these popes, some of them would just get sick and unable to rule. I mean, I'm not talking about, I mean, mentally not able. Like, what would they just be kind of put away and not seen, and other people would do their business?
Yes.
Is that
yes.
what
Yeah, that's part of it, and part of it also is that life expectancy in this era was so much shorter than now.
Right.
So you didn't have people, my age, doddering around. They were gone. And I think the life expectancy was somewhere in 50, 60.
50, 60.
So Benedict XV was around, what, 2013 is it? Or 20?
Yeah, remember what year did the present one come in?
2012. I know I was on a cruise in Tasmania, and that's where I first saw it. On the newsstand, I saw Pope quits, and it's...
5 years, I think it was 2012.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
2012.
And of course, he's still there, and once in a while makes a kind of ceremonial
But
appearance.
somehow it would seem that we've got now older popes,
Yes.
and the life expectancy is longer. So you would expect that how would they somehow never have
This problem
Alzheimer's
seems
or
likely to
never have
arise
any
more
kind
and
of
more.
like, does it hit everybody else but their group doesn't get hit, but
Yeah, if the Pope is totally incompetent, I mean just like in a coma or something like that, then they do have an apparatus for considering him technically deceased and having an election, but he has to be really gone, pretty near dead. So the problem you described is here and will be here for some time, and should get worse and worse. There's always been a tendency to elect older popes because there was always, what's he going to be like? If he's awful, we don't want him for 50 years.
Right.
But if his life expectancy is maybe 5 more years, we can grit our teeth and put up with anything that long.
Yeah.
Well, which ones had children and things?
A lot of them had children.
Yeah, a lot of them did up until when? I mean, from the beginning, did they all have children or?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of them had children before they were Pope. And they were still their children, but they hadn't violated the celibacy rule. In the Renaissance, there were lots of children. And there was, in the Renaissance and the late Middle Ages, 14th, 15th, and 16th century, the biggest sort of moral problem for the papacy was nepotism. That is to say, favoring the family. And the more family, the better. And so popes would often have illegitimate, I shouldn't say often, but pretty often, would have illegitimate children, and then sent them somewhere to get educated, and then kind of adopt them.
Bring them into the family business.
Yeah, bring them into the family business, exactly.
But the Medicis had a lot of money.
They did, yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I just checked on Benedict XVI, he resigned on February the 28th, 2013. So
2013,
2013.
okay.
Well,
that's a long gap, isn't it?
Not long ago, no.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, 600 years since his predecessor.
Yeah.
A long
Yeah.
time, 600 years.
Yeah, and I think that's why everybody was so kind of shocked by it.
Yeah.
We never heard of anything like this before.
Well, most good Catholics have no idea about all these old popes.
No.
No, no,
No,
no,
not at all.
Now, that's one thing I would like you to get out of this course. What Pope has meant to pretty much all of us throughout all our lifetime, it never meant to almost anybody before the 19th century, before even the late 19th century. Popes being kind of revered, followed closely, popes being moral teachers, teachers about social issues and things like that. The next one we're going to see was kind of like that. I mean, he was way before his time, very much a modern pope, Gregory the Great. But he was not followed by more of the same. As I think I said earlier, a lot of correspondence have been examined now, and what historians find is that most people had no idea who the Pope was. Most Christians, they were all Catholics then, and didn't care. It just didn't enter into their lives. Popes were known in the diplomatic corps and in the courts of princes and so on, because they had to do business with them. And the business was mostly secular business. It had to do with the papal states and jurisdiction and things like that. Papal documents were almost all legal documents, not pious documents, nothing you would want to meditate on any more than you would on the the tax return, something like that. Almost all of them, if they had training, education, it was in law. If they had degrees, they were in law. They were not in theology, they were not in morality, they were not in anything else like that. That went on very, very long. Canon law was the way to prepare for the papacy. And canon law doesn't touch on these other things at all. It's all the technicalities of legal maneuvering. The popes of the past and the popes of really pretty much my lifetime were two different kinds of people with different expectations and a totally different public, a public that barely knew them. And if they did know them, they knew them kind of as symbols of some political thing. Like the English knew that the Pope had excommunicated Queen Elizabeth and ruined their lives as a result, because in excommunicating Queen Elizabeth, the Pope said that Catholics in England no longer owed allegiance to the Queen, and that made them all automatically traitors, and therefore all automatically eligible for capital punishment. So the excommunication of Elizabeth brought misery to the Catholics of England. So they would know from that kind of thing. But remember, communications were not much unless you were in the upper stratum. If you had a crowd of couriers who carried your message from court to court. There was no mass communications of any kind. I mean, that began really with Luther, just before Luther with the printing press.
What happened when Henry VIII was excommunicated?
Well, that's what I was thinking. He
What
was
happened
the
when Henry VIII?
Henry VIII.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Henry VIII was again, a political issue between him and the Pope. And the issue, most people didn't know what was going on. Those who did know what was going on knew it to be a political thing. It was not that this Pope was very, very scrupulous about annulling marriages. Popes have been annulling marriages by the score, ages and ages and ages. Which is why Henry thought this will be a shoo-in. What's the problem? All I want is another annulment. They give them to viscounts, like that. But in this case, the annulment was an annulment of a marriage to the crown princess of Spain. And Spain had a lot more weight with the papacy than England did. So the Pope could not insult the monarch of Spain by saying, yeah, you can get rid of it. And there again, you can kind of see the legalism, because Henry's case for the annulment was based on a convenient adoption of Old Testament law about betrothal to a brother.
Right.
Now the brother was pre-pubescent. He was 8 years old or something like that when they were betrothed. Arthur died, and but he said that my marriage is clearly corrupt by the fact of that.
Yeah, they just had that program on.
Yes.
Yeah.
The 6 Wives, Tales of the 6 Wives.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah, it was good,
yeah.
That was,
That
Right.
was good. Well, the excommunication of Elizabeth was before Henry?
No.
Oh, after.
After.
It was while she was queen. Yeah.
Right. Well, she was queen.
When did Cardinals start electing the
Cardinals?
Start electing.
Well, cardinals are, the word means different things as time goes on. In the earliest usage, you want to get a glass of water?
She's got some water. She's got some.
Okay.
Yeah. Something that, when the airplane stops, that's when it starts.
In the earliest usage, cardinals were simply the priests of important, the pastors of important churches in Rome. Then later on, they became the pastors of very major churches in Rome. But that's still what they were. They were not, they had no role in the government of the church, but only of their own place. Then in the Middle Ages, all the way up to the Middle Ages, it was decided that the cardinals would elect the Pope. And before that, the cardinals, how did they get from just being pastors to being electors of the Pope? They were brought into the Curia. These were kind of the big shot clergy of Rome. The church was getting more and more bureaucratic. You needed a secretary of this, a prefect of that, and so on. Where were you going to look except to the cardinals? So the cardinals assumed those curial roles, and later also were given the role of electing the Pope. Before that, the election of the Pope was not quite random, but some popes were pretty clearly just appointed by the emperor. No pope could be elected without the emperor's approval. So that gave, veto power is a big thing. He can keep vetoing till he gets his guy.
Which emperor was this, I mean? Which emperor was this? I mean.
Oh, this is this will be under Gregory the Great. We'll see that in a moment. Which is Gregory the Great.
In more recent history, many of the cardinals, like in Latin America and Central America, really didn't get appointed by the Pope without the okay of the leaders of those countries.
Right,
I mean,
right.
Especially like China.
Right,
yeah,
sure.
right. So they would,
Yes.
yeah, yeah.
And of course, there were no cardinals of any place but Rome
Right.
for a long, long time. They all came from Rome. And then gradually that designation was applied to bishops elsewhere. Bishops are really important.
Say that's how John.
So when did the selection of the Pope, as we know now, when did that occur?
It occurred first right after the, in the 1200s. But it came and went and came and went. In other words, the popes made that rule, another pope could unmake that rule.
Okay.
It was convenient. So it wasn't stabilized really until probably 18th century or so.
Is it
Wow.
considered part of canon law now that it
Oh, yeah.
happens this way?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it was lifted to make it be part of canon law, so one pope can't change it.
Oh, a pope
yeah,
can
still change
throw
it.
canon law on the Tiber.
Pardon?
A pope can throw canon
No,
law
I
on
know
the
that,
river.
but it would be more serious.
Oh,
It
yeah,
would be more visible
Yeah.
to try to change it now.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
That'd be a good platform to run for Pope on. I'm gonna throw out this stack of books.
Canon laws
Papal
are-
election were also, sometimes went on for years because of the strife. And there are all kinds of, kind of funny stories. In Viterbo, they had an election of the Pope in Viterbo, Italy. And it went on, there was a lot of strife in Rome, so they wanted to get someplace more peaceful than that's north of Rome. So it went on and on and on and on. And finally, the equivalently, I don't know what title he had, the mayor of Viterbo said, take the roof off the place.
Right.
So they would be rained on. And still they went on and on and on. And they said, cut off the rations.
Oh,
So they were
Oh,
starved
wow.
and drowned into doing their job after something like 20 months. Now that happened many times.
Golly.
And, that was also a reason for the present thing. It has
Yeah.
to get done right then.
So was it in the 18th century then when we decided, where you have the smoke, whether it's white or?
Yeah, I think the smoke came in the 18th century, the white smoke. And
Right,
the
yeah,
black
we have a
smoke. I think that was an 18th century thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
When were the popes in Avignon? Because,
Oh, much earlier,
Much earlier.
much earlier, yeah. Yeah, we'll be spending some time with them too.
The two popes at the same time.
Oh, lots of
They're quiet.
two popes at the
Those.
same time. I think
Right.
probably maybe as many as 40,
Oh, yeah.
40 instances of that.
Of the
Sometimes overlapping for just a while, sometimes overlapping for the whole papacy. They
Wow.
came together and went together, and then were often succeeded. You know, the anti-pope would have an anti-pope successor. And of course, who's anti-pope and who's pope?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
You know, that's
yeah.
kind of an accident of history, depending
Yes.
on who had the most influence. And often that was emperors or kings.
Well, I mean, there's so much talk about the unbroken line of succession.
Mm.
If you had two popes at one time going on, I mean, how is that succession viewed?
Well, in a document called the Annuario Pontificio, which is an official document, you have the official line of all popes.
Okay.
But, you know, somebody made that up. So it's official, but it's not necessarily historic.
It's official but not infallible.
Right.
And that number is about 260 or something like that?
No, about 60.
Altogether, the number of popes is about 260 or something like that?
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Wow, I didn't know there were that many.
260, yeah, about 260. It is the oldest institution in the Western world. I mean, no royalty or anything like that has lasted that long. And, you know, although there are many questions about why was this a successor rather than that, it's not that bad on the whole. Most of them are, you know, pretty solid, sound, visible successors. The election process tends to go normally, but there are a number of little breaks in the line too. The succession thing, of course, I mean, the big theological issue about that, which is most found among Protestants, is that, you know, there's nothing in the scripture about a successor to St. Peter. Nothing about a successor to anybody. And then when the bishops got to be regarded as successors of the apostles, I mean, that got to seem pretty weird too, when you have, you know, many hundreds of bishops and just 12 little apostles. You know, each has a whole lot of successors. So those things all came in later. Another thing you probably won't notice without my pointing it out is that in church teaching, there is amazingly little about bishops and amazingly much about popes. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the popes controlled the councils after the very earliest ones, and they were most concerned with their own position, the validity of it, and the extent of it, and the empowerment of it. Popes get more and more and more powerful all through history. You know, it goes down when some of them are, you know, put in prisons and things like that. But the papacy itself is constantly more empowered. And therefore the governmental structure of the church becomes more and more unequivocally an absolute monarchy. You know, there's nothing that the Pope has to go by. The last stand was councils. There was a big movement in the church maintaining that a council, because it was representative of the whole church, was in a position to overrule the Pope. And that was eventually put down also. And that was really the last threat to absolute papal power, the conciliar movement.
And when was that?
That ran through the High Middle Ages, the 1300s, 1400s.
Nobody has challenged since then.
No. And, you know, how would you? You know? I mean, in a sense, there's no historical evidence for almost any of this. It's tradition. It's the way we've done things. So if that's how we've done things, that's how we've done things.
Were bishops or even cardinals for that, back before the current time, treated more harshly if they didn't toe the line with the Pope?
Yes.
Because it seems like today there's a little more gentleness about it.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But was that always allowed?
Well, there's a big exception to that, which is some bishops and later some cardinals ingratiated themselves with very powerful secular monarchs.
Yes.
I mean, the one everyone knows from fiction, all those Richelieu. I mean, Cardinal Richelieu, you didn't mess with. Not because the Pope was taking care of him, but because the King of France was taking care of him.
He was under a powerful patron.
Right.
Yeah.
And so with the English ones, Cardinal Wolsey. Now, he was finally done in by the king, and previously protected by the king. So the Pope was in no position to mess with him either. So that was the only way that a bishop could get sort of out from under the thumb of the Pope, by getting under another thumb, which was not that friendly to the Pope.
Yeah, but from day-to-day opportunities, they didn't know what was going on that far away.
Who didn't know?
The Pope didn't know. The information might have got there 3 months after something
Sure.
happened.
Yeah, that's
Sure.
true.
So it wasn't like today.
Yeah. And as more and more historians are discovering, in that gap, if the information was written down, it might very well be altered en route. You had to stop somewhere, and if it happened to stop in the court of some monarch who wanted that to say not no, but yes, he could put in the yes. And then historians later find an earlier version. And, so all kinds of things could happen to it, as well as it being very, very, very slow. Modern popes are known for their moral teaching. They're respected for their personal character. Older popes were generally not. I mean, no one expected that of them.
You mentioned, I'm sorry.
Sure.
You mentioned Boniface a little while ago, and you said you were going to talk about him later. You mean later today or later?
No, and later in the course.
Oh,
He's probably
Boniface is a medieval pope. We'll get to him maybe 2 or 3 classes from now. Yeah, Boniface was the one who maintained that the Pope had, well, his slogan was, remember the passage in the Gospel where Peter says in the Garden of Olives, we have 2 swords? Everything was interpreted allegorically. He couldn't have been talking about real swords. So what he was talking about was, this was Peter speaking, and he's saying, we have 2 swords, the sword of religious power and the sword of temporal power. And that became the doctrine, the 2 swords theory, that the Pope was actually, in virtue of Peter, had all power. And anybody else who had any power got it from the Pope. That came back again and again. Very early, though, you had claims, which will come up even in the career of Constantine and his followers, based on the idea, at least held by Romans within Rome, that the Pope, well, the slogan was, I mean, I'll give a few slogans over here. The Pope, judicat omnia. He judges everything. And is judged by nobody.
Wow.
That's a pretty good job to have. And that was taken quite seriously by the time of Gregory, where we are today. That was cited again and again, particularly within Rome. So when emperors or whatever wanted to put the Pope on trial, there would be a huge popular resistance to this. You can't judge the Pope. Yeah, you can kill him. And that's often what came of it. You couldn't dispose of him in any legal manner, so you disposed of him in other manners.
So there were popes that were killed?
Oh, lots, yeah.
Lots.
Yeah, lots.
Like 50 or something, or?
It'd be hard to tell. Well, if you put all the killings together, easily 50, yeah. I mean, some of them were killed by, by enemies, some were killed by friends, some were killed by family members.
While they were in office.
And we will see a little of her in the In the 10th century, there was a very wealthy Roman lady named Marosha. I forget which of the old Italian families she belonged to, but she was very, very wealthy, and she maintained, you know, like a hit squad, only these were suffocators.
The paper pillow.
And they suffocated at least 3 or 4 popes.
Poison too, a bit.
If Marosha didn't like you, then the guys with the pillows showed up.
We used to call it, get the papal pillow.
So when you talk
Die in
about
their sleep.
female influence in the church, keep Marosha in mind. So yeah, there were a lot of killings, and a lot of killings by popes as well. Now, you know, given 260 or so popes, this is a small fraction. And there were certainly periods of history which were atrocious, and this kind of stuff was going on all the time. And then you might go centuries with things being pretty decent. Okay. Oh yeah, I want to say something also about the barbarians. There were, you know, vast numbers of barbarians of all kinds. Barbarians meaning just not Greco-Romans. There was never a barbarian pope. There were, you know, later on, some of the barbarians turned into nations, and the Franks turned into the French, and there were lots of French popes. And maybe the Ostrogoths turned into the Germans in a much looser way, and there were German popes, of course. Most of the barbarians remained relatively nomadic. They fought with one another and kind of disappeared from the scene by their own interaction. But I tally up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that became nations. The tribes got together. They first kind of worked together, and then they said, well, let's get together and become a kingdom. And it was these kingdoms that presented the greatest problems for the Pope, because the kingdoms had armies and wanted to extend their land. And, you know, they behaved like nations. And since they do come up, I'll list them. The first are the Visigoths. Now the Huns would be a good example of the others. The Huns were, they never became a nation. They were always nomadic, and they were always dangerous. And they were eventually done away with by the forces of the emperor. But these others, the Visigoths, they originated, almost all of these that became kingdoms, and people have wondered why, originated in the same broad area, which was the western edge of Asia, the eastern edge of Europe, and Scandinavia. So from Scandinavia around, down through the Baltics, what's now Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, then down to the Ukraine, and a little bit east of there, into, you know, what's now pieces of Russia, Kazakhstan, and so on. So it's from there, for the most part, that they became kingdoms. I'm just going to put their end dates, 5th and 6th centuries. That was the end of them, and they were defeated by, again, forces of the emperor. But they had been very influential before that, and they originated in the Baltic area, maybe around Lithuania. The Ostrogoths. Visi and Ostro means west and east. So these are the Eastern Goths. They originated in what's now Kazakhstan, the Ukraine, and north of the Black Sea, in southern Turkey even. And they were undone in 552 again by forces of the emperor under a famous general named Narses. He actually fought them to a standstill and eliminated them. The Vandals.
Oh, yeah.
Who kind of don't quite deserve their name. They weren't, just running around messing things up. They were sometimes quite civilized, not always. They also came from that same general area, and they were defeated in 534 by Belisarius, a very, very famous Constantinopolitan general, and they vanish at that point. Now, where were they when they were destroyed? The Visigoths they set up their kingdom in southern France, more or less the Riviera area just beyond the mountains, and in southern Spain, so that's Mediterranean area. They lived there, they ruled there, they had capital cities there, they had armies there. The Ostrogoths moved into central and southern Italy, say from if you know Italy, from Tuscany down. The Vandals settled in southern Spain and North Africa. Now all these places are part of the empire. And then next, and in many ways most important, the Franks. The Franks settled down in France, and they're the one kingdom that survived. I mean, they're still there. The Franks occupied Gaul. They were first a bunch of tribes. They came together. The last two groups to come together were the Merovingians and the Carolingians. And that leads us to Pepin and Charlemagne and all of that, and very close ties with the church. And they established their capital city at Lutetia Appariciorum, Paris. And so there they still are. The Franks are the French, the Proto-French. And that leaves us with the Lombards. And the Lombards were around until 774. And if you're familiar with Italian geography, you know northwestern Italy is Lombardy, and that's named for the Lombards. But they extended beyond that into Austria and over the Alps and so on. I noticed they lasted until 774, and they were undone by the Franks at the request of the Pope. They continued to invade papal territory, and the popes asked the Franks to help out, and the youngest son of the king of the Franks, a little boy named Charlemagne, came and totally eradicated them. Okay. Obviously, as far as DNA is concerned, they're still with us. You can sort of stamp out every individual member of them, but their political identity was destroyed.
So they were Christians, but some were, in the early days, they were Arian Christians and not the papal.
They were almost all mixed.
Okay.
The Franks were totally Nicene Christians, Athanasian Christians, non-Arian Christians. Among the others, you would find both Arians and non-Arians. And as their kings came and went, you would get an Ostrogothic king who was an Arian and an Ostrogothic king who was a non-Arian. The king of the Ostrogoths who had the most influence on, certainly on the papacy, was Theodoric. And Theodoric was an Arian, but he was a non-militant Arian. He was, in many ways, he was a very enlightened person. I mean, he said there are Arians and non-Arians, and nobody can really prove one or the other, so let's all just do our own thing and try to make this place work. He was a pretty good monarch, actually. But he was actually, he was eventually done in also. The end of the Roman Empire is always identified with the coming of the Goths. And Odoacer is the one who's usually mentioned. But whether Odoacer was a Goth or not is really anybody's guess. The name is not Gothic. He was a high-ranking officer in the Roman military, so he was very well integrated into the Roman Empire and its military service. So nobody knows quite what he is, and so I haven't put just plain Goth up there. But in 476, he invaded and eliminated the last Roman emperor of the West with the name of Augustulus, Little Augustus. It's a diminutive of Augustus. And disposed of him and reigned until the Ostrogoths came subsequently.
But the Roman Empire in the East is the one that was still appointing popes and things like that
Well, popes were elected.
Were elected by 476.
By what? By the clergy of Rome.
476 AD.
When?
476 AD.
476 AD, they were elected by the clergy of Rome, yeah. But the Eastern Emperor had a lot of say in the matter, and could veto the election of the Roman clergy, and often did, for all kinds of reasons. Okay, a few intermediate items, and then little Leo the Great. Leo the Great was genuinely great. I don't mean Leo the Great, Gregory the Great. Leo was too, but Gregory was greater.
Well, what makes them put great? Are they always good when they're great? So-and-so the great, so-and-so the great. You know, I just wonder.
How did they get that label?
Yeah.
What were people thinking of? They were thinking mainly of securing the peace and prosperity of Rome and making the church work in a respectable, effective way. And they did both of those things. Both of them came in pretty chaotic times and went out with pretty good order, increased prosperity, a much better place for their being there. Gregory the Great came in during a famine and a flood, famine, plague, all those things went together. And he spent immense amounts of money and immense amounts of energy and organization trying to fix things, their kind of relief activities, which ingratiated him initially, of course. But let's take a look at him. Interesting character. Gregory the Great was a nobleman, a very, very wealthy Roman nobleman, with a lot of power based simply on that. He was a highly educated man who had been educated by scholars imported from Greece and all to teach him the things the Greeks knew more about than the Romans. And he had served for a time as prefect of the city of Rome, which would be the guy who actually did most of what was done there. Not total ruler of the city of Rome, but manager, like a city manager. He did that at the request of the people because they already kind of trusted him. And then he said, enough of this. I do not want a secular life. I want a religious life. And he seemed to be totally sincere about it. And so he became a monk and occupied a monastery with other monks and fully intended to spend the rest of his life there. He would, praying, of course, and also writing. This was a very learned man who wrote pretty good stuff, which is still read today.
Were there religious orders at that time, like Benedict?
No.
There weren't like the different
The
divisions.
Benedictines had just begun.
Just begun about 4.
He was not a Benedictine, but it's interesting you bring that up, because some Benedictines still claim he was.
Oh, okay, well.
He said he wasn't. He was a great admirer of Benedict and the Benedictines, but it was his little monastery.
Okay.
What time period was this?
What did he go in the monastery?
Yeah.
He went in the monastery about 565.
Yeah, because that would have been around the time the Benedictines were.
Yeah, yeah. Then he was asked to, would he mind just taking a vacation for his monastery and going to solicit aid from the Eastern Emperor for the suffering people of Rome. And so once again he did, and did not succeed in getting very much from the emperor, but succeeded in ingratiating himself with the emperor and learning about the emperor and the empire. So he came home with a scope of knowledge of kind of world politics in their world that hardly anybody else had, and tried to pass that on and go back to his monastery. He went back to his monastery and was dragged out. Apparently, actually physically, crowds came in and said, you know, we just need you. And dragged out and elected Pope. He said he refused the election. He did not want the election. He said, you can't refuse the election. He said, no, but I can appeal to the emperor to veto my election. Yeah, I guess. And he knew the emperor by then. So he asked the emperor to veto his election, and the emperor said nothing to him. You're just what they need there. So he was very much a reluctant pope, which is kind of good. I mean, he wasn't doing it for any kind of ulterior motives. He was united unanimously, and he began by organizing and staffing his own office very, very efficiently. He was famous for finding the right people for the right jobs. You know, he knew his way around and had the right motives. And, you know, people admired he's getting the right people doing things and doing them very well. So the Curia became very efficient, very effective, particularly in dealing with the poor of Rome and the military problems that they had with the barbarians. But I think we're going to have to leave him there doing nice things until next week. Okay.
That's it?
Yeah, we are nowhere near following our schedule. Knock off a few centuries. What's the century nobody likes?
I was bored.
Oh, God. Did you guys go get a cat?